Hi. I want to talk about architecture, but in a way I want to talk about prototypes. I want to talk about how ideas can change things, but also what it means to transfer an idea from abstract to reality, and what it means to ultimately build the buildings that we're thinking. Our work in that way presents a collection of ideas for how we may want to live or work differently, for how we want to perceive the spaces that we jointly inhabit, and maybe for how we can construct the sense of a community as humans are social beings. We're in Singapore, and I think it makes sense to talk about Singapore. And I've had the opportunity to actually build 2 buildings in this city over the past decade. If we look at Singapore, it embodies some of the issues that many Asian cities or many global cities face today. As people move to the city, density increases, and a predominant typology that defines our cities today are towers. Now, these buildings, if we look at them, some better, some worse, but many of them stand in no relation to each other. And if we would subtract the incredible nature and green that Singapore has as a tropical place, we would see that sometimes there's very little coherence between these structures. I'm interested for how we can re-establish a context and how we can define the world we live in relation to each other. I want to present a project that we just completed not too far away from here. And this project is particularly interesting because it does not only pursue an architectural or urbanistic agenda, it also pursues a political agenda. It is one of the first ever joint ventures between the governments of Malaysia and Singapore. And in that, I think, an incredibly important reconciliatory step in which architecture and design plays, if you like, a role in both manifesting, symbolizing, or in parts also navigating such a process. The piece of land given to us was what you see here between those 2 completely unrelated buildings, a little plot of no man's land in between to maybe most of the most difficult buildings in Singapore, because what was left in between had very little to do with anything. Yet it's a very exciting part of town. Kampong Glam, an important preservation district right next to it. Bugis, a vibrant commercial area. And I wanted to think about how can we not simply, as an architect, come and put a new piece of design in the middle of this that has nothing to do with what is there, but how could we conceive a building that was actually about creating space and reintegrating its context into a new whole. So I took the allowable building mass and started to carve pieces away from it, cut out a series of urban spaces and figures that I wanted to create, but ultimately incorporate the neighboring structures into a new urban context and ensemble. I created 2 central plazas that suddenly integrate what is around instead of deny. And this became a very successful model for repairing a part of broken city. You can see here the built buildings from the helicopter, and you sense how in this circular movement through the carving, we're able to resolve a highly complex piece of urban derelict land into a new coherent context. So it was about not only the carving, but also the capturing of movements, of flows. The concave movements of the facades channel the winds, create microclimates in the spaces and courtyards to increase livability, but also resolve all the complex other forces of the site, complex feng shui with the sharp blades of the building right across the street. And as you stand in the plaza and look up, you sense how dramatically exciting but also precise these figures are as they emerge, and as the silhouettes of the towers themselves, covered in a hexagonal shading system, become expressive aspects in the Singapore skyline. The view down and you see the landscape, and also the landscape, I think a very important aspect of it, almost a sense of liquid movement that flows through the site in order to announce permeability and connectivity of the project. Here you see the concept plan. Really a project that would reopen the ground floor and give it entirely back to the city in a 24-hour open and accessible space. So not create development and architecture as a subtraction from the city, but actually as an addition to the public life of the city itself. Here you see the buildings come down and dematerialize, and we send the message of openness and invitingness into the public domain. The idea to create a civic nexus and nucleus that would connect all the surrounding areas and become a new center for a previously a very isolated part of the city. When we talk about the future of cities, we also have to talk about the future of living and the question how we want to live. A second project that I realized here is a residential project, 1,040 apartments built not in the middle of the city, but rather a little bit outside, part of a big green strip. And I thought, what does it mean if we build a community, and a community in nature? In a way, it can't mean this. We had a 24-story height limit, and the typical answer would have been to design 12 towers to accommodate these apartments. But as you see, there would only be residual space around these towers, and they would even be too close to have privacy in the apartments. So what I did was I toppled the towers. I threw the vertical into the horizontal and started to stack those horizontal bars up on top of each other. And this is the build project. What from the sides evades a sense of logic, once you are inside or above, you understand that it's a precise system of a hexagonal grid that creates huge courtyards and gardens, spaces for the inhabitants and the people that live there, given to the community to enjoy their life. But not only the ground is greened and the spaces are exciting, but the intricate nature of this system allows us to also green all the different levels of the roofs, of projecting balconies and terraces, and ultimately create a very differentiated system that ranges from the very communal and public to the semi-private and the fully private in the apartment. So there's a huge amount of choice of which space you want to participate in. But another little piece of maths is interesting, because we're greening those roof terraces. If we add the amount of green left on the site, plus the gardens we created on the roofs, we have 112% of green space of the site area. So more nature than not having built a building. So in this case, a building doesn't take away from nature, but multiplies it and adds to it. And this is the 13th floor of one of these terraces. So it is not simply decorative green, but it is living space. People can have barbecues there, play cards, meet friends, read books. These are spaces really that enhance the diversity of life and the choices we have. The project was named World Building of the Year 2015 by the World Architecture Festival, and I believe it was an important recognition that Asia is able to set new standards in what is possible in the world today. If we talk about living, we also have to talk about working, because of course much of our life is spent at work. And how could we conceive a building that would change the way in which people communicate or in which people relate to each other? This is the headquarters for China's national broadcaster, CCTV, in Beijing. It was to be a skyscraper, and typically skyscrapers are vertical needles. But verticality sometimes can create isolation rather than connectivity. So we wanted to think of if we could not bend the needle of the skyscraper back into itself and create a loop of interconnected activities that were all about exchange and collaboration and being together in a non-hierarchical structure. And this is the building as it stands in Beijing since 2008, now completed for the Olympic Games in Beijing 2008, the first broadcast 2012 for the London Olympics. The idea was to look at a building as a live organism, not just as a matter of built substance, but I really like this diagram that we created because it reminds me always of biology classes in school, the human body, organs, circulatory systems. And if you think of a building as a life form, it changes a lot of things. If you think that it is made for people, that live in it and that ultimately communicate and create inside, you start to perceive a structure and conceive a structure in a very, very different way. So if you dissect this organism, you can identify a series of organs and clusters. These are the technical clusters: broadcasting, control rooms, and news section. And these are intertwined with social clusters: meeting rooms, canteens, chat areas, so that the social exchange and behavior of human beings would come together with the technical performance of the building. And all of this joined and interconnected through this loop of circulatory systems. These are the interiors, canteens, offices, and the broadcast control room from where more than 250 television channels can be broadcast simultaneously. The building changed perspectives in many ways, and only a few steps in the urban context can dramatically change the reading of it. And you will see 3 little holes at the very tip of this cantilever, and these are pieces of glass in a visitor's loop in which people can enjoy the vertigo of 160 meters below. The building is one of the largest buildings ever built in the world until today, almost 500,000 square meters in a structure without a single expansion joint, and with that, in a way, constitutes another superlative in what I think Asia was able to achieve over the past decades. And after work and the headquarters for a media and technology company, I want to show a very different headquarters for a culture business. It is China's oldest art auction house that decided to build its headquarters in direct proximity to the Forbidden City in Beijing, so going from the future, if you like, to the past and close to one of the most historically sensitive places in this great city. Right adjacent to it is a hutong, the old courtyard houses, the small grain of the historic city, and opposite the road, of course, the modern city has arrived with a completely different scale and the schism of how Chinese architectural identity could find its expression. My idea was to resolve this complex question in conceiving a base of the building that would be an extension of the small scale of the historic city, sediments of historical cubes and elements that would cluster on the site, and then I refer to the contemporary and modern city and float a single element on top of this cluster. So this is the photograph of the building we just completed in Beijing, and you see at the top a big volume of glass and below the cubes of the museum and auction hall spaces. You see the proximity, the view to the Forbidden City, the way that these cubes harmoniously blend in with the existing hutong right next to it, and the way that symbolism and contrast between modernity and history appear in a very different way. I started to bring in the soft texture of a Chinese landscape. We took a painting and projected it onto the facades, and what you see here, these tiny little dots, is actually a perforation of the facade that brings daylight into the building, and at night, light from inside to the outside. And it becomes a very playful tool to soften the experience and a lyrical element that further embeds this project in its context. Inside, the cubes launch basically the beginning of a museum, many spaces that will be curated throughout the year and present the art and everything done in the building to the public. At the center is a 1,700 square meter large column-free space in which almost anything can happen. So from museum to event machine, the auction halls themselves. And the building is really an intricate puzzle of many aspects. It's a new hybrid of a space, of a headquarters that is partly for administration, but also there to orchestrate events, host exhibitions, art, and a whole hotel and restaurant, a lifestyle component integrated to really create the celebration of life in all its hybrid forms as it exists. These are the views of the perforation from the inside as they bring daylight in, and the final image of the context that it always creates, a view outside to the hutong, the relationship between old and new, and how also history can be an important part of how we build the future. Thank you.